Marcus stood in his kitchen at 11 p.m. at night, staring at a spreadsheet he'd opened just to check one number, and instead of closing the laptop like he usually did, he sat down. The overhead light hummed. His coffee had gone cold hours earlier. He wasn't looking at a windfall or a crisis, just his own checking account balance next to his savings account balance, side by side, the way he'd looked at them 100 times before. But this time something shifted, quietly, without any dramatic trigger, and he found himself doing math he'd never bothered doing. This is the moment this video is about, and it happens to almost everyone eventually, usually without warning, and almost never for the reason people expect. My name is Emory, and if you've ever felt like your relationship with money moves at the speed of continental drift, slow, invisible, until one day you look up and the landscape has completely changed, then this video might help explain why that shift happens and what's actually going on underneath it. And if that's useful to you, sticking around and subscribing helps this channel keep making sense of the parts of personal finance that usually get skipped over. Most people think this shift is triggered by hitting a big number, a first six-figure balance, a first million, some milestone loud enough to force a reaction. They're completely wrong, and the reason matters more than the moment itself, because the shift isn't triggered by the size of the number at all. It's triggered by a change in what the brain is measuring. For most of someone's financial life, money is measured against immediate need. Can I cover this? Can I afford that? Does this paycheck get me through the month? The shift happens when the brain starts measuring money against time instead, when a person stops asking what a dollar buys today and starts asking what it becomes in 10 years, and that reframing, not the dollar amount, is the actual event. This connects to something behavioral economists have documented for decades, a concept called temporal discounting, which describes the brain's natural tendency to value a reward available now far more than a larger reward available later, even when the math clearly favors waiting. It's why a guaranteed $100 today often feels more appealing than a guaranteed $120 in a year, even though waiting is the better deal. Early in most people's financial lives, temporal discounting runs the show almost entirely, which isn't a character flaw, it's a well-documented cognitive default. The brain change that this video is describing is what happens when that default starts to loosen, when someone begins to genuinely feel the value of a future dollar instead of just intellectually acknowledging it. Here's where it gets genuinely interesting. That loosening doesn't happen through willpower or motivation the way most financial advice implies. It happens through repeated, direct evidence, specifically the evidence of watching money grow without having done anything new to earn it. Marcus's spreadsheet moment wasn't random. It came after roughly 4 years of consistent saving, the exact point where compound growth typically starts producing a number large enough to notice on its own, separate from whatever new money was added that month. That's not a coincidence, it's a predictable inflection point, and understanding why it happens where it does is the actual mechanism behind this whole video. To see why, it helps to walk through what's actually happening underneath the surface during those early years, because the early period is the part almost nobody talks about honestly. In year 1, someone saving $400 a month ends the year with roughly $4,800 contributed, and maybe $150 of growth on top of that, assuming a typical long-term market return. The growth is real, but it's small enough to be invisible, easily mistaken for rounding error, easily overshadowed by the effort of saving in the first place.
This is the phase that feels most like learning an instrument, where the early practice produces almost no audible improvement, even though the technique is genuinely developing underneath. And it's the phase where most people either quit or simply stop paying attention, not because the system isn't working, but because the system isn't yet loud enough to notice. By year 4, the picture looks different. Total contributions sit around $19,200, but growth has compounded enough to add roughly $2,800 on top of that, meaning the account is now earning, in a single year, nearly as much from growth alone as an entire year of contributions used to add in year 1. That's the specific threshold where brains like Marcus's tend to notice, not because $2,800 is a huge sum, but because it's the first year growth becomes large enough to feel like a second income source rather than background noise. This isn't about depriving yourself to get here faster. It's simply a mathematical checkpoint that most consistent savers cross somewhere in the 3 to 5 year range, whether or not they consciously register it. Someone might reasonably ask whether this shift is just psychological, a feeling with no real financial substance behind it. It's a fair question, and there's truth in it. The underlying mechanism, compound growth, was working identically in year 1 and year 4. Nothing about the math itself changed. But the reframe genuinely matters, because behavior follows perception more reliably than it follows spreadsheets. Once someone starts feeling their money working independently of their labor, saving stops requiring the same amount of willpower it did before, because the brain has shifted from viewing savings as sacrifice toward viewing it as a second, quieter income stream. And that shift in perception tends to produce real measurable changes in consistency and contribution rates going forward. By the time this same pattern reaches a milestone like $650,000, which for context sits well above typical median U.S. household net worth, the brain shift has usually solidified into something closer to a working mental model rather than an occasional realization. At this stage, growth alone in a single year can outpace what a full year of contributions produced in the early phase by a wide margin, and the psychological effect compounds alongside the financial one, because someone who has now watched this pattern repeat across multiple milestones stops needing to consciously remind themselves it works. This is genuinely a version of having your cake and eating it too, continuing to work and live normally, while a second, largely passive process keeps building in the background. And it's the point where a job loss becomes an inconvenience rather than a catastrophe, and an unexpected medical bill becomes disruptive rather than devastating, because for the first time there are real options sitting underneath the number instead of just the number itself. So when we returned to Marcus at his kitchen table, the moment his brain changed wasn't really about the balance on the screen. It was about crossing an internal threshold where future money finally started to feel as real as present money, a threshold built entirely out of repeated, undramatic evidence rather than any single dramatic event. The math doesn't reward urgency, and it doesn't punish a late start either. It simply keeps working, quietly, for as long as someone lets it, until one ordinary night the number on the screen finally says something the spreadsheet had been saying all along.